Today, I want to talk about relationship poisons, whether in your marriage, whether with your children, or in your friendships. Now, I am a root person. I see beyond the surface level and I see the big picture. Now, we very much need practical and detailed people in this world, just as much as we need big picture and root people in this world. But I think more often, as far as relationships are concerned, root people and big picture people are needed more. I think in this case, the devil truly is in the details and the Lord is in the root. So let's use a very common scenario to explain what I mean. There's a couple that's been happily married for 10 or 15 years, and then suddenly the wife finds out the husband has cheated on her. Most often, of course, the wife takes this personally. She's not enough. Her husband doesn't love her. Her husband loves this woman more. She's not attractive enough. She's not a good enough wife. Or her husband is just a cheating dog. They fight back and forth over these details and they get divorced. So, of course, every situation is different, because people are individuals. So there won't be this roadmap to exactly what happened. The point is to find out what happened, because the cheating is the result of the root issue. The cheating wasn't the issue itself. There was an initial cause, and that cause is important. So I want to talk about some of these relationship poisons that I believe aren't talked about enough. When people are asked, what happened in your relationship or why did you get divorced, those are normally the answers. Well, my spouse cheated, or we fought all the time, we couldn't get along, or they just abandoned me. Yeah, that's what happened in the end. So the question is, why did that happen? And usually by that point, there's a plethora of reasons why. I just want to discuss some of those reasons. Now, I think one of the biggest relationship poisons in any relationship is being taken for granted. And the reason issues like this are so often overlooked is because they build up slowly over time. And many people can't even articulate what they're experiencing or feeling. They don't have the language for it, or they don't automatically think to themselves, I feel taken for granted. They just know they have an adverse reaction to the way their spouse is treating them. Even in my own situation with my spouse, the only language I had and the only way I could articulate it was, I don't like the way you make me feel. I couldn't articulate it beyond that point at that point. And so what does that mean? How does someone receive that? I don't like the way you make me feel. Well, how do I make you feel? What am I doing? I'm not yelling at you. I'm not putting you down. I'm not cheating on you. So what am I doing wrong? And that is why it's so important to understand this and to be able to have language for it, to explain to your spouse exactly how they make you feel and why. And that's not to say that'll fix it. Because if your spouse is taking you for granted, maybe they don't care how you feel. And maybe they'll just dismiss you and keep doing it anyway. That's not something you can control. You're going to have to take accountability for yourself. You be the person and you treat your spouse the way you want to be treated. And then you let the Lord deal with them if they're not treating you the same. So let's talk about what being taken for granted feels like. Initially, you may have thoughts like, I just don't matter. Nobody cares about me. I just don't matter, which is very easy to internalize. Why don't people care about me? What's wrong with me? Why don't I matter? And maybe part of it is you. Maybe you give too much and expect too little. Maybe you're a people pleaser. I don't know. But you're not being taken for granted because you don't matter or because nobody cares about you. But when you're being taken for granted, you will feel like your thoughts don't matter, your feelings don't matter, What you do is not appreciated. Your opinion is not valued. You're dismissed. You're mocked. You're laughed at. You're shrugged off. That's what it feels like to be taken for granted. It is an assault on your very identity. It is a very big deal. And a person can only take so much and live that way for so long before they snap. And whatever that snap is, looks different for every individual. So we're just going to use the cheating spouse as an example, simply for an example of being taken for granted. It does not mean that that's the case for every relationship, but we're going to paint this scenario just to explain that example. So let's say this wife started taking her husband for granted. Who knows her reasons? She just started doing it. Maybe they started out really in love and he was a really good husband and he did everything he could to make her happy. And she started getting used to that and she started getting comfortable in that. And little by little over time, she apologized less for her own issues. Each thing she felt like she got away with or didn't have consequences for made her more and more comfortable in her own sin. And maybe she just got to the point that she was like, I don't need to apologize because he's not going anywhere. And that is exactly why people take others for granted, because they believe they are irreplaceable and that person is going nowhere. I'll never forget one time I worked at this job and I was so good at it and my bosses loved me. And over time, I did so much work there. I was doing 3 people's jobs that I started feeling like, what would these people do without me? And I was telling my dad about it. And he was like, that's great, that you're so good at your job and that your bosses love you. But let me give you this one little piece of wisdom. Never think you are irreplaceable. It may feel like it right now because you do so much, what would they do without you? But it's a big mistake to ever think you are irreplaceable, because you are irreplaceable at every job that you work at. And I kept that little nugget with me for the rest of my life. And it is so true. Of course, when I left that job, sure, they struggled. They had somebody that was doing 3 people's jobs and they had to replace me either with 3 people or take a lot of time to train one person on 3 jobs. But life still went on without me and I was replaced. So never, ever think you're irreplaceable in any situation. Life goes on without you. And thinking you are irreplaceable is what causes you to take whatever situation or relationship for granted, and then you get replaced. Kind of funny how it happens. So this is what the wife in this scenario does. Little by little over time, she's irreplaceable. There's nothing she has to be accountable for. He's going nowhere. Then she finds out he cheats. The marriage is over. I'm sure she's very shocked at that point because she really felt irreplaceable and took her husband for granted and never thought he would do something like that. And then, of course, she just thinks he's the worst thing in the world. He's a cheating dog. He's not who she thought he was, and he just deceived her. That's not what happened. This wife made her husband ripe for a situation like this. Solomon in Proverbs very often warns against the adulteress. And it could be very easy to just focus on the adulteress and, stay away from that Jezebel and, it's all her. But how exactly did this man fall for this trap of the adulterous woman? Proverbs 6:24 says, "It will keep you from the immoral woman, from the smooth tongue of a promiscuous woman." The King James Version says, "To keep thee from the evil woman, from the flattery of the tongue of a strange woman." Over and over in these warnings about an adulteress, it talks about her flattering tongue. And I want you to understand what a trap that is for a spouse who has been taken for granted for way too long. Okay, so they're in their marriage. They're trying and doing everything they can to make their spouse happy, to be appreciated, to be valued. And, the wife in this situation just keeps dismissing her husband, keeps dismissing his feelings. She wants to take from him, not give. She's never accountable for her own issues. And then he comes across this adulteress when he is incredibly thirsty to be seen and valued. Here comes this woman flattering him when his soul is desperate and thirsty for recognition. How hard do you think that would be to resist? Now, of course, many people would say, well, that's no excuse. He cheated and there's no excuse for it. And that's true. All of us are accountable for our own actions. Of course, it's wrong for him to cheat on his spouse. But she did not make it easy for him. We are all human beings, and we all have a breaking point. If you are slowly killing your spouse's spirit and self-worth, and someone comes along that the devil sends, when they are desperate, you can't expect people to just be strong enough to overcome everything. Everybody has a breaking point. So that wife has to take responsibility for the fact that she set her husband up for this. She made him feel worthless. She made the trap of the flattering tongue adulteress easy. I just watched a case on YouTube yesterday where a husband caught his wife cheating and shot her, and she died. And I was reading the comments because they were so mixed. And some people were like, you never murder someone over something like that. You leave. And then other people were as cold to say things like, well, she got what she deserved. But there is nuance. Of course, her husband should not have murdered her. Of course. But she did cheat on him and he snapped. You don't know what another person's breaking point is. The wife who is taking her husband for granted while he's, trying to fulfill all her needs while getting none of his met, was completely shocked to find out her husband was having an affair. Just like I'm sure this woman was completely shocked that her husband shot her for having an affair. You don't mess around with people like that. You don't play games with people's hearts, and you don't assume when you're going to make a bad decision or sin, especially in relationships, that the consequences will be small. When the man that snapped murdered his wife, that's all anybody sees. And when the man who snapped cheated on his wife, that's all anybody sees. But there was initial cause. And both spouses have accountability in the situation, even though the reaction of their spouses were far greater. One committed adultery and the other murdered his wife. There are big consequences for the seemingly smaller things. So, of course, I feel for the wife whose spouse cheated on her. The pain is unimaginable, but she helped him do it. She has responsibility in this situation, and finding a new spouse isn't going to change it, because she will get in the same situation, take that spouse for granted, and then the same type of thing will happen. That part needs to be fixed in her so she can protect her spouse from the adulterous woman instead of deliver him on a silver platter right into the arms of the adulterous woman. So, how do you not take someone for granted? I asked the Lord this myself a while back. Because like the saying, you never know what you have till it's gone. I said, Lord, how do you know that you're taking someone for granted in the moment? We don't always want to look back and reflect in hindsight and say, oh, okay, that's why that happened. How do you recognize it in the moment and change it? So what he showed me was very simple. Unfortunately, most people are very quick to tell others something negative about themselves or something they need to change, even in parenting, but very little, if ever, give affirmations, even if we think them. It's just so natural to say, you did this thing, and unnatural to say, randomly, you do this thing that's wonderful. A wife may dress up and try to look extra special for her husband one day. And her husband comes home and he does think to himself, wow, she's beautiful. But he doesn't tell her. Why? And that's what the Lord said to me. When you think these things about these people, tell them. Don't just keep it to yourself and assume they know you feel that way. In the same way, you will quickly tell them something negative in the moment. When you feel or think something positive, tell them. Who doesn't want to hear good things about themselves? So I started doing that in all my relationships, friendships, family. I started doing it because I realized how often I thought wonderful things about these people and never told them. They need to know these things. They need to know their value to you, that they're not just some placeholder in your life to serve your needs. When you let someone know how much you value them and appreciate them, it encourages them to be better. It encourages them to keep going and doing those things that you value and appreciate. If you never see any fruit from your labor, you lose the motivation to labor. And a spouse that feels taken for granted eventually doesn't want to do anything for their spouse anymore. But when you make that spouse feel valued and appreciated, they see the fruit of their labor, and it encourages and motivates them to keep doing that thing. Seeing no fruit or seeing negative fruit discourages them. And if you just come to this realization today, maybe, that you've been taking your spouse for granted, the problems that you have didn't happen overnight, and they're not going to be fixed overnight. If tomorrow you start affirming your spouse and you haven't in 5 years, they're not going to be like, yes, my wife values me. They're probably going to be suspicious of you. They might be thinking, what has she done? Has she cheated on me? Or what does she want? So you're going to have to be patient and consistent. And don't feel offended if your spouse is suspicious of your sudden affirmations after you've taken them for granted for 5 years. Don't be discouraged by that. Just turn over a new leaf today and keep going. And again, we are all accountable for everything that we do, every sin. And a wife taking a husband for granted isn't an excuse for that husband to cheat. But you have to recognize the humanity in your spouse and don't place burdens on them that you couldn't carry yourself. Don't give yourself all the grace in the world for your snapping points or your sins, but expect your husband to resist an adulterous woman when you make him feel like he has no value. Take accountability for yourself. Be the wife that protects your husband from that, because he knows without a shadow of a doubt that his wife values him, not flatters him. You know the difference between flattery and sincere value. Don't just make up things to say to prevent your husband from cheating on you. Be sincere. Don't just tell people the negative things that you see. Tell them all the positive. Affirm them in the moment. You certainly don't forget to say the negative things. So say it in the moment so you don't forget. And if you do all these things and you affirm your spouse and you don't take them for granted and they still cheat on you, okay, there's a different problem there then. And we're only talking about taking someone for granted. We're only using this scenario as an example. And you'll have to go to the Lord for what the root cause was of this scenario if you did not take your spouse for granted. And just remember, even if your spouse is maybe doing a lot of things that are negative, there's a reason you love them and there's a reason you married them. As angry or disappointed as you may be in them, you do have positive things to say about them. And if you can't think of them, sit down and be intentional about them and write it down. And when you find those positive things about your spouse that you love, that made you fall in love with them, that you value, that you're so grateful for, tell them.